It was America's most powerful tank. It was supposed to be a nightmare for the Soviets, but its real story is that of one of the loudest, most expensive embarrassments in Pentagon history. This 56-ton giant consumed hundreds of millions of dollars, yet in its entire service life, it never once fired at an enemy. Not once. Its crews didn't call it a tank destroyer. They called it a mobile death trap. Its engine was an accident waiting to happen, and its targeting systems would fail at the worst possible moment. Why did American generals spend a fortune on a weapon they were afraid to send to the front, even in the middle of a war? What colossal miscalculation forced them to build a tank for a battle that never was? And what ugly congressional scandal nearly buried the careers of top Pentagon brass? This is the story of the M103, a superweapon that turned out to be an expensive, useless toy. We'll show you how fear, panic, and corruption gave birth to a steel monster that became a symbol of military failure. Don't miss the shocking conclusion. It will make you see the arms race and the price of paranoia in a whole new light. September 1945, Berlin. The city, reduced to rubble, briefly came back to life to the roar of tank tracks and engines. The Allies were holding their victory parade, and the reviewing stands, decked with flags, held the entire Western military elite, American, British, and French generals in dress uniforms glittering with medals. The mood was almost festive. The Great War was over, the enemy defeated. But that mood was brutally shattered when a steel procession, not on the official schedule, rolled onto the cobblestones of the central streets. These were the new generation of Soviet heavy tanks, the IS-3s. Their appearance had the effect of a bomb going off. Instead of angular, high silhouettes of familiar tanks, low, squat machines with futuristic, flattened turrets glided down the streets. Their armor wasn't just thick, it was sloped at rational, steep angles, drastically increasing its shell resistance. And from the massive cast turrets, the barrels of new 1,222mm guns looked threateningly down. For the Western observers, fresh from victory, this was a cold shower. Among them stood General Dwight Eisenhower. His usually calm face became inscrutable. It suddenly became clear that the war just ended might have been only the prologue to a new, even more high-tech confrontation. An unspoken question hung in the air. If these machines already exist, what are Soviet designers preparing next, and what can we possibly answer them with? This shock wasn't unfounded. The American Army ended World War II with a bitter awareness of its own lag in the heavy armor class. Its tank forces were still based on the M4 Sherman, a machine respected for its reliability and sheer numbers, but hopelessly outmatched in duels with German heavy tanks. Its 75mm gun couldn't penetrate the front of a Tiger or Panther at normal combat ranges, forcing crews to take deadly risks maneuvering for flank and rear shots. The price for each destroyed German giant was measured in several burned-out Shermans. The late answer, the M26 Pershing, with its more powerful 90mm gun, appeared only at the very end of the war. And while it finally gave an adequate response to the Panther, compared to the IS-3s seen in Berlin, it already looked like not cutting-edge weaponry, but a belated attempt to catch a departing train. Thus, the Berlin Parade became not a ceremony, but a clear strategic signal. The Cold War, not yet named, began right there, on the cobblestones before the stunned generals.
In American headquarters, an understanding instantly crystallized. Now they didn't just need an improved tank, they needed a fundamentally new machine, created with one clear and frightening purpose: to become the undisputed killer of Soviet heavy tanks. It had to surpass them in everything: have thicker armor, a more powerful, longer-range gun capable of hitting targets over the horizon. So, under pressure of fear and paranoia, on the soundtrack of the nascent arms race, a project was launched that was supposed to give birth to America's steel champion. But instead of triumph, it turned into the story of one of the loudest and most costly failures in history: the story of the M103.
The search for an answer to the Soviet challenge plunged American design bureaus into a series of expensive and fruitless experiments. Even before the dust settled on Berlin's cobblestones, engineers were already working on supertanks conceived late in the war to fight German giants. Monsters like the T-29 with a 105mm gun, the T-30 with a 155mm howitzer, and the ambitious T-34 armed with a 120mm gun saw the light of day. These were true mobile fortresses weighing over 60 tons. However, they all suffered from the same ailments: excessive complexity, unreliability, monstrous fuel appetite, and a complete lack of clear understanding of how and where to use them in the new post-war reality. With the end of hostilities, funding for these programs was sharply cut, and they quietly faded away, leaving behind only a mountain of reports and a few rusting prototypes in the back lots of proving grounds. But the threat embodied by the IS-3 demanded not an experiment, but a concrete, serial solution. Under pressure from increasingly alarming intelligence about new Soviet developments, particularly the IS-4 tank with even more powerful armament, designers hastily cobbled together all previous work. The result, in late 1948, was the T-43 project, the machine that would later become the M103. Engineers tried to learn from past mistakes. They rejected extreme weight in favor of an optimal 50+ tons, gave the hull and turret a streamlined, elliptical shape for better shell resistance, and chose a new 120mm rifled gun, the T-53, as the main caliber. On paper, it looked solid. Calculations showed the gun could defeat any known Soviet armor at ranges up to 2,000 meters. However, the project itself was born in an atmosphere of haste and strategic uncertainty. It was a reaction, not a thoughtful move, an attempt to plug a technological gap, not to create a balanced weapon for a future war. It was at this moment that external events compounded the internal panic, creating a perfect storm for catastrophic decisions. The invasion of South Korea by North Korean troops in June of 1950 was perceived in Washington not as a local conflict, but as the first act of a great war with the communist bloc. Generals, remembering the shock from the IS-3, demanded an immediate acceleration of all programs to create heavy equipment capable of stopping the Red Hordes. The irony was that in Korea, American tankers faced not modern Soviet giants, but old T-34-85s, which Shermans and Pershings handled successfully. But wartime logic tolerates no nuance. In January 1951, on the sound of cannon fire on the Korean peninsula, the Pentagon, without waiting for the results of comprehensive testing, even of an experimental T-43 model, signed a contract worth $99 million, an astronomical sum at the time, with the Chrysler Corporation. The order was categorical: begin immediate serial production. Questions about the advisability of sending a 56-ton tank destroyer to the mountains and jungles of Korea, where there wasn't even a single worthy opponent for its huge gun, were ignored.
strategic foolishness was elevated to the rank of urgent state necessity. Thus, on a wave of military hysteria, a deeply raw, conceptually dubious and tactically useless project for the current conflict was launched into mass production, dooming itself and the taxpayer-funded budget to a monumental failure.
In November 1951, fresh off the still warm assembly line, the first serial T-43 embarked on its first and most important journey, not to the front in Korea, but to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It was here, in conditions as close to combat as possible, that the fate of the entire costly program was to be decided. What unfolded before the engineers and military inspectors exceeded the darkest expectations and quickly escalated into a full-scale catastrophe. Aberdeen became the place where theory met the unforgiving reality of metal and mechanics. The tests revealed not isolated flaws, but a systemic crisis in the design. The tank's heart, the gasoline-powered Continental AV-1790 engine borrowed from the medium M48 tank, proved utterly inadequate for the 56-ton behemoth. It ran at its limit, constantly overheated, and broke down after just hours of intensive use. The transmission also failed, not designed to handle such torque under constant load. The suspension, with its independent torsion bars, couldn't bear the weight. Road wheels deformed and failed quickly, and the suspension itself sagged, robbing the tank of its already modest ride quality. But the problems weren't limited to the chassis. The tank's combat characteristics, its very reason for existing, were also in serious doubt. The massive cast turret, a symbol of its power, rotated with difficulty. Its traverse mechanism constantly jammed, which in battle meant certain death. The fire control system, meant to ensure the accuracy of the legendary 120mm gun, was unreliable and finicky. Optical sights fogged at the slightest temperature change, completely robbing the gunner of the ability to aim. The process of loading the huge, separate rounds by two loaders was desperately slow and exhausting, negating any hope for a high rate of fire. Even the basic survival of the crew was at risk. The emergency escape hatch was so tight that in a crisis, men could simply get stuck in it. Following these humiliating trials, military inspectors compiled a monstrous list of 144 mandatory modifications. Effectively, it was a verdict. The tank, in its current form, was completely unfit for adoption, let alone deployment to a theater of war. It was at this moment that a loud scandal erupted. The Army Command, having already spent millions and expecting ready machines for Korea, faced a hard line from the contractor, the Chrysler Corporation. A fierce bureaucratic war began. Generals accused engineers of shoddy work and contract breach, while the engineers, in turn, pointed to unrealistic deadlines, Pentagon pressure, and the initially raw technical requirements. The conflict dragged on, and the war in Korea was meanwhile drawing to a logical conclusion. When the armistice was signed in July 1953, 300 brand-new, shiny, but utterly useless T-43s were already sitting in warehouses. The American Army, dreaming of a steel fist, received only a very expensive and extremely problematic burden that had to be justified to taxpayers and Congress somehow. The illusions were dispelled, leaving behind only a bitter aftertaste and piles of substandard metal. By 1953, when the Korean armistice was signed, 300 brand-new heavy T-43 tanks stood in neat rows in U.S. Army warehouses. Each of these machines had cost the budget about $330,000, a fantastic sum for the time, enough to buy several medium tanks. But these impressive steel rows were deceptive.
Behind the shiny, freshly painted armor hid a bitter truth. Not one of these tanks was ready for combat. Their engines overheated, transmissions failed, and targeting systems malfunctioned. The Army found itself the owner of the world's most expensive mass-produced scrap metal. Sending them to the troops was pointless and dangerous, but writing off new equipment into which hundreds of millions had been sunk meant a major political scandal. This scandal was only a matter of time. In July 1957, it broke with full force. A House Committee on Government Operations subcommittee made public the results of its investigation. The report was merciless. Investigators stated they couldn't even determine the program's total cost due to the chaos in the documentation, but it was clearly in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Congressmen harshly criticized the chain of decisions. The Pentagon, succumbing to panic over the Korean War, launched a deeply raw project into mass production, a project originally created for a different war, against Soviet heavy tanks in Europe. In Korea, no such threat existed. The result was an absurd picture. Gigantic sums had been spent on a weapon not needed for the current conflict and unfit for the future. To somehow justify these colossal expenses and escape the humiliating position, the Army was forced to begin a massive and costly modification program. Only after making 98 mandatory corrections, which stretched out for years, did the tank finally receive the official designation M103 in 1956 and was formally adopted. However, even after this, it inspired no enthusiasm. The Army, taught by bitter experience, took only 80 of the 300 machines onto its books, managing to bring just 74 up to standard. The remaining 220 units were practically forced upon the Marine Corps, a branch that traditionally relied on mobility and needed a static heavy tank the least. Thus, the Titan, conceived as a fearsome killer of Soviet machines, began its journey as an unwanted, problematic inheritance, shamefully divided between two branches of the armed forces that viewed it more as a burden than a breakthrough weapon.
Trying to save face and somehow justify the giant expenditures, the command decided to send the M103 to where it was, in theory, supposed to be king of the battlefield, to Europe. In January 1958, the 2nd Battalion of the 33rd Armored Regiment, the only unit in the U.S. Army fully equipped with these machines, arrived in West Germany. But practice quickly dispelled the last illusions. During exercises in Bavarian forests and on the ranges of the Rhineland, it became clear that operating the M103 was sheer misery. Its mobility was illusory. A weight of 56 tons made the tank an unwieldy colossus. A top speed of 21 miles per hour, 34 kilometers per hour on roads was laughable, preventing it from keeping pace with the lighter M48 Pattons on the advance. On rough terrain, it turned into a slow-moving target. But the main nightmare was logistics. The aircraft-derived gasoline engine had a monstrous appetite. Fuel consumption reached 235 to 250 gallons per 100 miles, 900 to 950 liters per 100 kilometers. Its operational range barely exceeded 80 miles, 130 kilometers, meaning refueling points had to be organized literally over every hill. Any deep operation involving the M103 turned into a logistical hell for supply troops. And the darkest ghost was the recovery problem. A knocked-out or simply broken-down tank was practically impossible to recover from the battlefield with standard equipment. Its weight made the task unsolvable, dooming the expensive machine to loss, much like what often happened with German Tigers during the war. Against this backdrop, the only silver lining remained the main gun, the 120mm rifled M58.
The ballistic characteristics of this gun were indeed impressive. Its armor-penetrating shell at a range of 2,000 yards, 1,800 meters, was guaranteed to penetrate 8 inches of armor at a 30-degree slope. In theory, this gave the M103 an undeniable advantage in a long-range duel against any Soviet tank of the period. However, theory collided with harsh reality. The low rate of fire, due to the outdated separate loading and the work of 2 loaders, negated this potential in a dynamic battle. Unreliable fire control and stabilization systems reduced the probability of a first-round hit. But most importantly, the presumed enemy itself had changed. The Soviet Union had bet not on a few heavy giants, but on the mass production of universal medium tanks like the T-54 and T-55. Against these machines, the monstrous power of the M58 was overkill, while its shortcomings were catastrophic. By the early 1960s, a final understanding of the dead end matured in U.S. military circles. Cumbersome, expensive, complex to maintain, and tactically helpless outside the conditions of an ideal long-range duel, the M103 became a walking anachronism. The new doctrine, formulated around the concept of the main battle tank, MBT, demanded universality, mobility, and technological balance, all the M103 lacked. It turned from the command's dream into its migraine, a heavy, unwieldy, and monstrously costly burden that needed to be disposed of as soon as possible. By the early 1960s, a quiet revolution in thinking had taken place in U.S. headquarters and military academies. Analysis of the experience from World War II and Korea, along with weapons development forecasts, led to a radical conclusion. The future did not lie in dividing tanks into narrowly specialized classes. The era of light scouts, medium workhorses, and heavy duelists was coming to an end. It was being replaced by the elegant and effective concept of the main battle tank, MBT. The ideal machine was seen as a universal soldier, protected enough to survive on the battlefield, armed enough to destroy any target, and mobile enough to maneuver quickly and concentrate forces. The new M60 patent, already entering service, embodied this philosophy. Against its backdrop, the M103, with its excessive weight, pathetic mobility, and colossal gun created for a single scenario, looked not just obsolete, it looked archaic, a relic of a mindset stuck in the past. Paradoxically, intelligence also brought information that finally buried the M103's raison d'etre. It turned out that the Soviet Union, the very one whose IS-3s had spawned this program, had long since abandoned the path of creating super-heavy tanks. Realizing their tactical limitations, enormous cost, and complexity, the Soviet command had bet on mass production and versatility. The T-54 and T-55 tank lines became the backbone of the Soviet armored forces. These were not invulnerable giants, but balanced, technologically advanced, and most importantly, mass-produced machines, perfectly suited for deep breakthroughs, rapid maneuver, and high-tempo battles. Exactly the scenarios where the clumsy, gas-guzzling, and supply-tethered M103 would have been utterly useless. Thus, the Americans spent a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars creating a killer for an enemy that, by the time the weapon was ready, had almost disappeared from the battlefield as a concept. The outcome became inevitable. In 1963, without much fanfare, the Army Command made the final decision that ended an entire era. All units armed with heavy tanks were to be disbanded. The sole battalion of M103s in Europe was dissolved, and its expensive machines were loaded onto ships and sent back across the Atlantic to storage depots at home. The doctrine of the heavy tank as a specialized killer of its own kind had lost. It fell victim to the evolution of military thought, which chose the path of unification, flexibility, and balance. The M103 became the last, most powerful, and most expensive monument to this bygone doctrine. Majestic, imposing, but ultimately absolutely useless in the new reality of armored warfare.
While the Army was relieved to get rid of its M103s, writing them off as a costly mistake, the U.S. Marine Corps, always independent with specific requirements, saw some potential in this machine. The Marines, whose key task was and remains forced amphibious landings on hostile shores, viewed the heavy tank not as a duelist for European fields, but, after modifications, as a floating armored pillbox. In their concept, the M103 could become a powerful tool for fire support of the first wave. Its monstrous 120mm gun was ideal for destroying coastal fortifications, bunkers, and concentrations of equipment, clearing the way for infantry, while its thick armor gave it a chance to survive the withering fire on the beachhead. That's why the Marine Corps continued to invest funds and effort into improving the 220 machines it had inherited. The apotheosis of these efforts was the M103A2 version, introduced in 1964. This upgrade was the most extensive. The old, unreliable gasoline engine was replaced with the diesel Continental AVDS 1790 from the M60 main battle tank, which not only improved reliability, but also radically, from a pitiful 80 to a solid 300 miles, 130 to 480 kilometers, increased the operational range. A new fire control system was installed, and optics were improved. A total of 153 tanks underwent this transformation, becoming a formidable on-paper force for naval assault. But here, too, fate played a cruel joke on them. None of these machines ever fulfilled its original mission. Several M103A2s were urgently deployed to the base at Guantanamo Bay during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, sitting by the fence line as a psychological argument in the cold confrontation. And when the real hot war in Vietnam began, the command didn't even consider sending these 56-ton giants into the jungles, where they would have been absolutely helpless. Thus, the final chord of the M103's story sounded with bitter irony. The tank, born from fear of Soviet armored hordes in Europe, in its entire life never fired a single shot at a real enemy. It never left the United States, except for the short tour of one battalion to West Germany, where it essentially sat as a museum exhibit. Its crews trained for decades for a grand tank battle that remained only on staff maps and in exercise scenarios. In 1972, the Army officially put an end to the program, retiring the last M103s. The Marine Corps, more attached to its equipment, held on until 1973, after which its machines were also sent to reserve storage depots, where they were gradually cannibalized for parts or scrapped. Today, surviving specimens, glistening with fresh paint, occupy places of honor in U.S. military museums. The M103 stands among them not just as a rare tank. It is the perfect monument to the very essence of the Cold War, an era in which the military-industrial complex could spawn monstrously expensive, technologically complex, and tactically useless monsters, created to counter threats that either didn't exist or vanished before the weapon was ready. It is a monument to paranoia, bureaucratic caprice, and that strange logic of the arms race, where the mere existence of a giant was sometimes more important than its actual combat value.